Hey everyone, this is Miss Moriarty. I'm here to discuss with us our last and final topic of the school year, and that is 9.10, which is all about the human impacts on biodiversity. Now, with this topic comes an acronym that we really need to be familiar with, and that is HIPCO. HIPCO outlines pretty much all of the main human impacts that are going to lead to a decrease in biodiversity. So the first one, the H, that's going to stand for habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation, or habitat loss, however you want to call it. The I is for invasive species. The P will be for human population growth. The next P would be for pollution, followed by climate change, and then lastly, overexploitation, or sometimes can be referred to as overharvesting. Now with this slide comes kind of like an outline of some examples of our acronym of HIPCO. So remember, with the H, this stands for our habitat loss or habitat fragmentation, which is typically the main leading cause of a decrease in biodiversity, because without a habitat, those organisms don't have food, they don't have the resources in order to survive. We can see that happen due to deforestation, right, to clear land for agricultural purposes, to create cities, roads. We could see wetlands be impacted by the draining for similar reasons. We know invasive species, right, like our zebra mussel, the kudzu vine, our spotted lanternflies, they all have the ability to outcompete native species, which forces their populations to decline. With human population growth, this one I feel kind of drives pretty much all of the other human impacts as well, right? Because if our human population is going to continue to grow in the way that it does, that means that we're going to most likely need more space in order to survive, which drives more habitat fragmentation, more loss. It winds up driving more climate change. We're going to need more resources in order to survive, increasing overharvesting, maybe the production of pollutants and the trade of invasive species. So I feel like population growth kind of drives all of the other human impacts as well. And then looking at pollution, right, pollutants, this could be really any type of pollutant that we've talked about. Things like pesticides, atrazine, DDT, right, we know they can all kill, right, certain species, accumulate in their tissues. Oil spills have the potential to reduce the population sizes of marine organisms for years even after the oil spill itself. Climate change, we know, can shift the range of the habitat for an organism, change the pattern of temperature and precipitation, causing them to adapt or migrate to different areas where they're maybe less likely to survive. And overexploitation or overharvesting. This is like poaching, hunting. All of those are going to lead to potential extinction or population decline. Now, some examples of habitat fragmentation we can kind of see in the three images here, right? So we see habitat fragmentation when we take a much larger ecosystem and create much smaller, more isolated areas. This is usually for the purpose of, making roads, maybe pipelines, clearing out a forest for agriculture or development. Now, not all species is going to be impacted in the same way when we do this, right? Breaking that much larger habitat into much smaller ones is going to create very small subpopulations, and when we do that, we reproductively isolate those populations. So what we could start to see is a decline in genetic diversity, which makes that population more prone to extinction and less resilient to any type of disturbance. But what can we do to kind of mitigate that issue? We can create what's called habitat corridors or wildlife corridors. These are kind of ways in which we can ensure that those subpopulations do have a way in order to reach back to the metapopulation or the much larger population that they once were. This can create some gene flow and hopefully improve the genetic diversity of those populations in that segmented area. Now, what about organisms that kind of live along an ecotone, or what's called an edge habitat? So these are where two habitats kind of overlap, so almost like a forest grassland type situation, or even like an ocean river, like an estuary would be a good example of that, right? So what happens to those types of species? Well, lots of ones that are specialized to live in those areas tend to have high biodiversity because we see a variety of food and resources for them. But as we continue to fragment land even more, right, into much smaller areas, we create more edge habitats. While some species are going to thrive in those areas, some may not, and so we can refer to that as their edge sensitivity. How well are they going to cope with now, not necessarily being in the heart of that specific biome, but now kind of being on that edge habitat, having different types of food, different types of shelter or habitats, resources for them to survive. Now, how will climate change impact biodiversity? Well, we know back from topic 9.5, right, with climate change, we know that is driven by, right, an increase in global temperatures, which can then wind up changing, right, temperature and precipitation patterns all around the world. Who's going to be impacted by that the most? Is going to most likely be our forest type ecosystems, our Arctic ecosystems, and so on. So our boreal forests, temperate coniferous forests, ones that, are more a little bit higher in terms of the latitudes, are going to most likely shift now more northward. We're going to probably see a shrinking of our tundra biome due to the melting of sea ice and glaciers in that area, as well as the permafrost. That warmer global temperatures are going to probably decrease precipitation in certain areas, maybe causing soil desertification and eventually desiccation, right, where it can no longer sustain vegetation. We're going to also see an expanding of tropical and subtropical areas, and most likely no longer having estuary habitats. If we know sea levels are going to rise, those kind of edge habitats where we see freshwater and saltwater kind of mix are going to most likely be fully submerged and become more saline, more saltwater. So we're going to most likely see lots of those habitats practically disappear as climate change continues to shift habitats. Now, some other human impacts that could wind up lessening biodiversity, and we've kind of seen this over time, is the domestication of a lot of species for agricultural purposes, right? Fewer and fewer plant species are grown naturally as selective breeding and genetic modification continues to produce very high yield species. We tend to see now less genetic diversity amongst our crops, which can make them more vulnerable to disease, pests, or environmental disruptions. So historically, there have been about 8,000 or so breeds of the 11 species most commonly eaten by humans, and you can kind of see what they originally looked like, and now over time, through so much selective breeding and modification, this is kind of what we now have today. Now, many of those breeds that once existed are now obsolete. They are extinct because now what we do is we only choose things that are going to give us the highest productivity. And so now we're kind of lessening the genetic diversity, narrowing it down, and unfortunately making it harder and harder for maybe those types of crops to adapt to climate change. Now, how do we wind up mitigating issues involving biodiversity loss? Well, we could establish more laws, requirements for the protection of important habitats, right, like our natural nature preserves, national parks. As I mentioned in a previous slide, for habitats that may be fragmented by human development, we could establish more wildlife corridors, right, areas in where species can migrate safely to other habitats to increase gene flow. We could establish more urban growth boundaries, right, when we are going in and we are planning how a city is going to be set up. We can create boundaries to protect wildlife in those areas. We could establish more parks, more urban gardens, green roofs. to produce more vegetation, provide habitats for species, pollinators. We could use more sustainable agriculture methods, which is going to lessen our chances of emitting pollutants, right, enhancing climate change. We could lower our meat consumption. Any forest that may be clear cut, maybe we could go in and do selective cutting instead, or replant those cut down forests. We could reestablish maybe old fields, right, that are no longer in use, and we can put those ecosystems back the way they once were, and over time, through ecological succession, they could return. All right, folks, this is our last and final practice FRQ. If you want to pause the video at this point, you want to jot down your answer to the FRQ in your notes, as well as answer in the Edpuzzle video. All right, so here in our practice FRQ, it asks you to identify one specific human activity that may result in the loss of biodiversity and explain how that activity lowers biodiversity. In B, it said for that human activity proposed, you needed to provide a practical strategy other than just simply banning the activity to reduce the loss of biodiversity. So some things that we could have said, remember, we know habitat loss, fragmentation is going to be a human activity that can certainly decrease biodiversity. We know the combustion of fossil fuels that can lead to ocean warming, coral bleaching, eliminating habitats for marine organisms. The introduction of invasive species in areas where they don't normally reside can outcompete or displace native species, causing populations to decline. Water contamination, right, due to excess fertilizers with commercial agricultural use can create algal blooms, right, causes a decrease in dissolved oxygen. Right, any number of those could be accepted. Remember, though, in B, you had to make sure that you kind of connected what you said in A to now what you propose in B. So if you mentioned habitat fragmentation, you could have said a strategy could be using smart growth boundaries or establishing wildlife corridors to help prevent the isolation of populations. To help lessen the amount of greenhouse gases, we could use more renewable energy resources, right, such as solar panels, hydroelectric power. For invasive species, we can implement tighter inspections and laws against the trade and import of species. We could regulate more non-point sources of pollution, right, such as fertilizers, or commercial fertilizers, by using more buffer zones around waterways. Helps prevent things like erosion of sediment and maybe that fertilizer winding up in that waterway itself. All right, everyone, that is it for our video here. If you have any questions, please leave that at the end of the video.